how did you get here for it? Did you take a train?
Yeah.
Okay.
They feel like they have right instead of having like
I was considering taking a bus because it's cheaper, but then like if, I feel like if you go,
I haven't done that though. So let me know.
it's like $20, right? And if you go like late at night with traffic,
Welcome. Please take your seats and silence your cell phones. Our program is about to begin.
Access to safe drinking water and sanitation infrastructure are basic human rights. But 2 billion people around the world don't have access to safe drinking water, and 3.6 billion people lack access to safe sanitation services. If these trends continue, an estimated 4.4 billion people will lack both by 2030. Aqua for All is announcing a Clinton Global Initiative commitment to action to expand its Making Water Count program in water-stressed regions of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This initiative aims to improve access to water and sanitation services through public and private investments. It will raise $32.7 million to provide 3 million people with clean water while prioritizing inclusivity and sustainability. With this commitment, Aqua to All and its partners are taking an important step forward in developing innovative, inclusive solutions to the challenge of worldwide water scarcity.
Please welcome Secretary Deb Haaland, United States Department of the Interior.
Gwatsi Halpa, Duhiname Itzatiritza Shuimi Hanu. This is a greeting in Keres, my ancestral language from the Pueblo of Laguna in New Mexico. Laguna is a place where my people grow corn in the high desert landscape. We raise our families with a keen sense of our deep connection to the earth and believe that we are here so that future generations can thrive. So, greetings everyone. My name in Keres translated is Crushed Turquoise, and I'm from the Turquoise clan. So, Gwatsi Halpa, and thank you all for welcoming me here today as we collectively address the greatest challenge of our lifetime, the climate crisis. To the Clinton family, thank you for making this crisis, a central pillar of the Clinton Global Initiative's outsized efforts. Everyone in this room understands these simple truths. The climate crisis is real, it is happening now, and it is uprooting lives across our planet. Every day, millions of climate refugees face the heartbreaking decision to abandon the homes and lands that their people have lived on for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. I grew up among the desert mesas in New Mexico, and when I was young, I hauled water with my cousins so that my grandma would have water to cook with in her kitchen, and also we'd have water to wash ourselves and to clean. My grandmother would never waste one single drop of water, not only because of the care it took for us little kids to carry buckets of water at least a half a mile. She was teaching us how precious water is in the desert. This summer, the river we relied on, the Rio Grande, ran dry in many places on its journey south. Here in the United States, the climate crisis threatens the ancestral homelands, landscapes, and lifeways that indigenous communities have stewarded since time immemorial. Since day one, President Biden has unleashed an all-of-government effort to address the climate crisis and prioritize communities that have been historically left behind. The Department of the Interior is proud to be a partner and leader in this historic charge. One of the places where the President's Investing in America agenda is making a historic difference is in Native communities across our nation. At Interior, millions of dollars are being leveraged to revitalize indigenous communities with 21st century infrastructure, provide economic opportunity, and fortify homelands against the climate crisis. These are communities where the climate crisis is a daily reality. I have met with tribal leaders who are navigating their people through extreme and chronic threats like storm surge, flooding, and tsunamis. Lives are being disrupted by rising sea levels that are already at their doorsteps. In response, we have committed $135 million toward a new voluntary community-driven relocation program which assists tribal communities severely impacted by climate-related environmental threats. 3 communities have been selected to receive $25 million each to fund relocation efforts, while additional tribes will receive funding to support their adaptation planning, implementation, and capacity building efforts. Tribes like the village of Napakiak in Alaska and the Quinault Indian Nation in Washington State are accessing this essential funding. With these important resources, communities can remain on their ancestral homelands at higher and safer elevations. It's never easy to leave behind a family home, but tribes are leading these relocation efforts, and the department is here to support their visions for the future. Our work must address the immediate crisis of today, but we must also have an eye toward reinvigorating the landscapes and ecosystems that define indigenous identities and then offer tangible solutions to the climate crisis. These important places can help us to meet this moment, and they should matter to all of us. This includes revitalizing the prairie grasslands, a shared ecosystem that stretches from Canada to Mexico, and the powerful creatures that depend on it, the American bison. As a keystone species, the bison is essential to the health of our grasslands, other species, and the tribes who rely on them for subsistence and traditional practices. Our country's revival of the bison from the brink of extinction is a conservation success story, but more work is needed. To continue these efforts, the department recently announced $5 million from the President's Investing in America agenda to support tribally led initiatives to strengthen bison conservation and native grassland habitats. This will ensure that this powerful, sacred animal is reconnected with its natural habitat and the original stewards who know best how to care for it. I am so proud of the work that U.S. officials across our country do every single day to address the climate crisis with the urgency it demands. But this work cannot end with this administration, and we cannot do it alone. Public-private partnerships are needed to leverage historic federal investments and are essential in this work, not just to address the challenge of the climate crisis and what it presents, but for empowering our up-and-coming generations of climate stewards. This is especially true for young Indigenous stewards whose connection to and understanding of the lands and waters that we all cherish must be at the forefront of our work. Growing up, I helped my grandfather tend to our family's cornfield and discovered how deep our connection to the earth really is. And that's why I launched the Indian Youth Service Corps last year. Through this program, we provide meaningful education, employment, and training opportunities to Indigenous youth through conservation projects on public and tribal lands. The Corps will help these young people strengthen their connection to the lands and waters that their ancestors have cared for since time immemorial. And that is why today we are committing $15 million toward this program. And I hope you will join us. I challenge everyone in this room to either meet or surpass this commitment so that the department can expand this program for more youth in more communities across this country. We have some folks from the department here who I would love for you to talk to about this effort, and I want to ask them to stand right now. Thank you. So my wonderful colleagues, please connect with them if you're interested in learning more about this amazing program. It is the passionate folks here that have the power to make the change we desperately need to make possible for current and future generations on the scale that this crisis demands. I hope that each of you can feel empowered by this challenge and the opportunities it will open for thousands of Indigenous youth across our country. I am so honored to be your partner in our shared effort, and I look forward to the progress we will all accomplish together. Dawa e. Thank you so much for having me, and please enjoy the rest of your discussion. Thank you.
Please welcome David Miliband.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Secretary Harlan. That was really a fantastic demonstration of what a committed government can do if it's willing to put financial muscle behind local communities in a serious public-private partnership. My privilege is to be the President and Chief Executive of the International Rescue Committee, which is a global humanitarian agency helping people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster to survive, recover, and gain control of their lives. And so in the remaining 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes of this session, we're going to try and take the perspective that you've heard domestically from Secretary Harlan and apply it to the international level. The good news is we have some fantastic speakers. The bad news is you have to listen to me for 2 or 3 minutes just to frame the discussion. And I've talked to several of the speakers, and it would be wonderful if in the course of our discussion we can bring in the audience and let you play some sort of role. If someone says something that you really agree with or really disagree with, please put your hand up. I'll try and keep my eyes open to catch your hand, to see your hand, and try and bring you in as the discussion proceeds. As I say, we're going to focus globally. And last year at CGI, I talked about 3 statistics that we should bear in mind, and I think they help frame this discussion. Statistic 1 is that there are 54 civil wars going on. Civil wars are the primary cause of people's forced migration. Second statistic is that 110 million people have been displaced by conflict and disaster around the world. About 55 million of them are internally displaced, and 45 million are refugees or asylum seekers going beyond their own borders. Please take careful notes. There'll be a test later on to make sure that you've got it right. And the third statistic is that there are about 350 million people suffering from food insecurity. Now, the interesting thing about those 3 statistics, or one of the interesting things, is that they're all affected by the climate crisis. Climate spawns competition over resources, which is a source of conflict. Disasters, or the global warming, is associated with more extreme weather events, which drives people to move. And food insecurity is obviously a significant part of the challenge that is created by the climate crisis. Now, here's the problem. The record of the climate movement and the humanitarian movement in working together to figure out how to address the combined challenges is actually very poor. And I say that with no pride, obviously. But the urgency of finding ways for the climate movement and the humanitarian movement to work together, I think goes directly to the topic of this panel. Now, here's the thing. Governments are not distinguishing themselves by their ability to step up to the challenge, and that's why I think the initiative of the Clinton Global Initiative, the efforts of the Clinton Global Initiative are so important. They're bringing the private sector, NGOs together to try and offer some of the solutions that we hope governments will support. And in the course of this discussion, we're going to try and bring out those solutions. There are 4 things I'd like you to try and bear in mind as we go through the discussion. The first is that risk mapping remains really poor. The situation in Southeast Sudan, for example, is different from the situation in Northwest Sudan. One's got a drought, the other's got a flood. We need much better risk mapping. Second, we need much better innovation in respect of climate adaptation. The issues facing the mayor in North Dakar, which you'll hear about soon, they're different from the issues of farmers in northeast Syria, who we're actually working with. Thirdly, we need new delivery models, because the traditional assumption that multilateral development banks can work with national governments to deliver change in local communities doesn't work in the fragile and conflict states that are most vulnerable and least resilient to the climate crisis that we're facing. And fourthly, the financing for climate and the financing for humanitarian efforts can't remain in separate boxes. And I hope that in the course of our discussion over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll be able to draw out some of those cross-cutting issues, because I think they're really important to making progress. And as I say, we've got fantastic speakers who are themselves focused on solutions, and that's really the theme of today's, actually the whole conference. I'm going to start with a fireside chat. As you can see, the fire is burning beautifully here. I'm going to start with a fireside chat with Amalie Tower. As you can see from the material that's been sent out, she's an extraordinarily entrepreneurial NGO leader, and I'd like to welcome her to the stage. Now, Amalie, please come up to the stage. So, Amalie, you are the CEO of Climate Refugees. So let's start with, what is a climate refugee? How many are there? And how should we understand the challenge?
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. There is no definition for climate refugee. It's a term that I think is popularized by the media, but and we've come a long way with resistance and hesitancy to even use the term because of its conflicts, shall we say, with the 1951 Refugee Convention, which we'll hear about a lot more about later, and also sometimes from displaced communities. And to David's point, not everybody dislikes that term. Certain regions disliked that term because it didn't quite resonate with how they perceive mobility as a right. So there is no definition for climate refugee, and that's because the 1951 Refugee Convention defines a refugee as somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution, who's left their country, and is seeking protection on the basis of that fear along 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. This is largely informed by World War II. In 1951, it had a geographic limitation of only applying to people fleeing Europe, and it also had a temporal limitation. It wasn't meant to last this long. And in 1967, we have an additional protocol that lifted that. And I took the trouble to mention that because in 1967, we also had the breakdown of colonial pasts and a lot of new states. And I would just say, we don't have time to go into all of it, but the global dynamics of displacement today, David, do not match the framing from the late 40s. So much so that in 67, we saw the wisdom of that, and we adopted an additional protocol to expand it to wider geographies and also time. And I would posit that maybe we're at another crossroads again.
And it's fair to say, though, at the moment, that if you look at the evidence, there are more climate IDPs, internally displaced, than there are climate refugees who would have crossed a border. That's fair, is it?
It's fair, based on the very limited data we do have. We are only essentially tracking internal displacement. And even that, the Special Rapporteur, Ian Fry, from within the UN Human Rights Architecture, has even pointed out that even that's limited, right? We don't really know. By and large, what we do know about is internal displacement within the context of disasters. In climate change, we have sudden onset disasters, cyclones, hurricanes, storms, things that happen rather unexpectedly, and they're happening with intense frequency and intensity. And we also have slow onset climate change events: drought, rising sea levels, desertification, environmental degradation to some extent. Those things are happening incrementally, and we're not gathering that data nearly enough To say nothing of, we don't know what this looks like cross-border.
That's very helpful, thank you. One of the areas of greatest humanitarian need at the moment is the Horn of Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, and your organization has just published a report last month on climate impacts and the mounting cost of climate-induced loss and damage in Kenya. And I think it would be great if you could tell us a bit about what that report said, why it's instructive for the wider issue that we're discussing today of forced migration.
Yeah. Well, thanks for mentioning that. The report is called Climate Change is Controlling Everything. Let them compensate us, which is a direct quote from the near 100 people that I interviewed in 10 distinct locations in Kenya, a country I have lived in and multiple times and was still flabbergasted at what climate change is doing to Kenya. Kenya is a low to middle income country, an ally, not just of the United States, but in the conflicts in the Horn of Africa, in the war on terror. You know, if you think about what's happening, of 181 countries that are at most at risk to climate change, Kenya is ranked 158 in terms of its risk. What's happening there is there are populations, and these are indigenous and marginalized populations. So we do have to look at the legacies of colonialism. We have to look at the legacies of land tenure. We have to look at the legacies of what does it mean to be marginalized and an ethnic minority, because this is very much an intersectional issue. This erodes human rights. And there are populations all throughout the Rift Valley who are dealing with lake rise from excessive rains that have begun as early as 2010, and they have been displaced. The numbers are about 700,000 people officially, but I've heard the Kenyan government at the Africa Climate Week just 2 weeks ago actually say 2.3 million. So how do we know? And it goes to my earlier point, right, about the lack of clear data. And then in the Turkana region, we're in the 6th failed rainy season for the Horn of Africa. So these are populations that are completely agrarian, pastoralists, agro-pastoralists, completely dependent on land and natural resources for livelihood. So they're dealing with extreme food insecurity. Famine levels, for any humanitarians in the room, IPC 5 would be famine level. There are places in the Horn of Africa and in Kenya that are flirting with 4 and 5. And there's a lot of cross-border migration going on in the IGAD region of East Africa, which, by the way, is happening in an organized way as a solution to climate change.
Let's talk about climate adaptation, because your report says in the absence of effective climate adaptation, there are communities who are now sustaining losses and damage that are not only eroding development goals, but are denying basic rights. I want to ask you, what works in climate adaptation? Let's accept that it costs money. At the moment, if you're a Somali, the average Somali has $1 per year spent on them on climate adaptation, despite the fact that Somalia's contribution to global warming is absolutely minuscule. But tell us what you've seen that works in climate adaptation.
Well, first of all, let's frame that a bit. In the climate finance, only 30% is spent on climate adaptation, although we hear pledge after pledge about we have to help people build resilience and, you know, actually acclimate. I don't use the word as a pun, but really, literally, like, build resilience to the climate crisis. 30%. Africa's share of that is 3%. The continent most affected by climate change, guess what? It's Africa. The Sahel is warming 1.5 times faster than anywhere else in the world. 3%. So with what are you going to adapt, David? It has been non-existent. Already we know from the UN, if adaptation finance doesn't increase tenfold by 2035, Africa is looking at even a more grave situation. So that's why I say, in the absence of climate adaptation, people are left to fend for themselves. And that's what's happening. People are literally getting, we have development setbacks, right? We have the UN Sustainable Development Goals happening right now. Is it any wonder that we're so far off target? So this is a situation of, in the climate architecture, I mean, I'm a humanitarian, so I've had to learn a lot about the climate world as well. We also have a fund that was agreed to be set up last year called Loss and Damage, but it has absolutely no money in the fund yet. And there's a lot of political barriers to making that happen. But that would be a huge solution and tool, because right now populations are fending for themselves with almost nothing.
Just partly because, for the sake of argument, but also because I think it's an interesting point. loss and damage, by definition, comes after the event. We've just conducted a study at the International Rescue Committee in northern Nigeria about anticipatory action. That's where I was trying to sort of lead the witness when I said, what have you seen that works in adaptation? And surprise, surprise, if you give people cash in advance of a climate disaster on one side of the valley and give it to them after the climate disaster on the other side of the valley, and you do an RCT, a randomized control trial, giving people money in advance helps protect their assets, protect their livelihoods. You're right that only 30% of climate finance goes to adaptation. The percentage that goes to anticipatory action is absolutely nugatory. Germany is the only country in the world that has a commitment that 5% of its climate funds should go on adaptation. And I wondered if you could begin to speak to that question of how can communities get, I don't want to say ahead of the game because climate change is already affecting them, but how do you think they can, do you see that anticipatory action movement as being something that's important to get behind?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, cash transfers, especially for agrarian communities that have lost all their livestock, for example. If you're a pastoralist, what do you make your livelihood out of? That would be huge. But you know, David, I know we're both humanitarians. You know, I've worked for the IRC as well numerous times. We have to get out of our own way a little bit here as humanitarians. This isn't an issue of just charity or assistance. This is an issue of justice. Kenya has a carbon footprint of less than 1%. Africa as a whole, 54 nations have a carbon footprint of 3 to 4%. So to bear such a disproportionate burden should not be in the hands of something as simple as cash transfers. To help people, what? Alleviate the worst of the crisis by just a little bit? To me, that's not a mechanism of justice. And so this isn't necessarily a humanitarian response. Anticipatory action is going to help us save lives and move people out of harm's way to a greater extent. But does that build back their lives? Does it build back what's been lost? It does not. And that's why we need an entirely different architecture that responds to this crisis from that standpoint.
We've got 1 minute and 42 seconds left, and for this part of the discussion, I've been given such strict instructions, this sort of lightning bolt will come down on me if we don't finish on time. Remembering that, there's only 1 minute and 32 seconds left now. Just one aspect of this response that you're talking about, and that's the role of the NGO sector. You lead an NGO. Many of the discussions about climate mitigation and adaptation are done in the billions and they're done in the intergovernmental sphere. How does the local context, the local NGO, the local people get into this equation? 1 minute and 6 seconds.
Well, that's the thing. The local context is not even, it's not there, it's not represented. You know, I'm a big proponent of we shouldn't just be aiming for representation, we need to be aiming for inclusion. I've said this to every organizer who's ever asked me to speak. I don't need to be here. A climate displaced person needs to be here. You know, we need to be intentional about creating and carving out spaces for people whose lives we're supposedly creating policy for to be in the room. You know, it's the reason why I do what I've orchestrated my work to be this way. I go to places to talk to people, and if you read the report, it's not a plug or a pitch. It's story-driven. We have to tell stories, David, so that in Dubai this year, in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, here at the GA, you know, it's not delegates and diplomats that are doing all the talking, representing the wills of foreign policy governments, right? Not the wills of state. This needs to be a democratic process for justice for the people that are by far the most adversely affected.
That was very weird timing because the bolt of lightning did come
Yes.
exactly as it hit,
Yes.
0 seconds. Amelie, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your contribution. Really look forward to seeing what you do in the future. Thanks very much indeed. Please give a round of applause. Now, this leads on to one of my favorite parts of the whole CGI process, and that is the announcement of calls to action. And we've got two inspiring leaders who are going to announce calls to action today. The first is Vishal Gotke, who's the CEO of Kiva, and he's going to announce a call to action. Please come to the stage and make your announcement.
I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. But our bank does not lend to refugees. They are simply too risky to serve. Xiomara kept hearing this message over and over again. Xiomara is a refugee. She fled from Venezuela to Ecuador, and all she wanted to do was set up her own small business. But the message to her was very clear. Despite having a nursing degree from Venezuela, she was too risky. For far too long, financial service providers have disregarded refugees because of the notion that they are not viable customers. And that misconception is the very foundation of Kiva's commitment to action. Expanding financial opportunities to 75,000 refugees by 2026. Hello. My name is Vishal Khodge. I'm the CEO of Kiva, and I'm honored to be here with all of you today to share why Kiva is so passionate about serving refugees. With the growing crises of global conflict and climate change, many believe that by the year 2050, we might have as many as 1 billion people displaced from their homes. And we know that refugees are not a homogeneous population, but their problems are quite distinct. There is always need for humanitarian assistance. Refugees also need help in terms of long-term resettlement. We know that, that economic independence is critical for people to resettle. And yet, as we saw from Xiomara's example, that access to funding is not always a given. And this is why, in 2016, Kiva started offering loans to refugees. We have this unique asset of a risk-tolerant crowdfunding platform with which we have worked with local organizations that invest in refugees. And what we've seen is very impressive. Our global borrower repayment rates over the last 18 years for Kiva have been about 96%. Can you guess what the repayment rates from refugee borrowers were? 97%. So we have shown with data at scale that refugees are just as viable a customer segment as any other borrower segment. In fact, they are so reliable that Kiva was able to launch one of the only investment funds out there that exclusively invests in refugee financial inclusion. It is for the success of people like Xiomara that Kiva commits to reaching to 75,000 refugees and providing at least $60 million in loans by 2026. But we can't do this alone. We need partnerships with individuals, with corporations, with foundations. So please join us in this effort, as we want to make sure that next time Xiomara is looking to grow her business and trying to access capital, she hears a resounding yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great job. Thank you. Now, I'm particularly pleased to introduce our next guest, because Nazanin Ash is not only the CEO of Welcome US, she is an alumnus of the IRC Leadership Factory that is producing brilliant leaders to go out around the world. Naz, come up to the stage and announce your commitment to action on behalf of Welcome US.
I learned from the best. Hi, everyone. I'm Nazanin Ash. I'm CEO of Welcome.us, a national initiative that works to mobilize and empower American communities to help welcome and resettle refugees. We do this work because we believe that if we tap into the generosity and compassion and ingenuity of Americans in every sector and in every community, we will find the national capacity and the willingness to welcome many more, which is what the crisis of global displacement demands. What I want to share with you today is that this belief is proving true faster than we ever imagined. A year ago at CGI, I shared with you the early success of our work to mobilize Americans to participate in a new innovation, private community sponsorship of refugees, first established at scale to help refugees fleeing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We shared that in just 5 months, Americans had signed up to sponsor more refugees than the whole of the US government had admitted in the previous 5 years combined. Based on that success, we worked with government partners to expand these innovations to other populations in crisis, including Haitians and Venezuelans, and then with the State Department to help launch the Welcome Corps, the boldest innovation in refugee resettlement in 40 years, which allows Americans to directly sponsor refugees from crises globally. We then mobilized leading private sector and civic sector partners to rapidly build the scaffolding for this reimagined refugee resettlement system. Private sector partners helped us build sponsorship hubs with resources that have been downloaded nearly 350,000 times. They powered our efforts to inform American communities about how they could sponsor and be a bridge to safety for someone who needed one. They built a matching platform where sponsors could connect with refugees who were seeking sponsorship. With grants through the Welcome Fund, we built a network of over 240 organizations in 40 states, mobilizing communities to volunteer to welcome and sponsor refugees in their communities. Our partners included Lions and Rotary clubs, veterans and faith groups, and refugee and diaspora-led organizations. Now, because of the rapid efforts of our ingenious private sector and our motivated communities, we are seeing exponential growth, led by the strength of our diaspora communities, but joined by what Tocqueville saw in us, the desire that Americans have to roll up their sleeves and solve problems together. Today, I want to share with you that in just 18 months since these innovations were first launched, Americans have now signed up to sponsor more refugees than the whole of the US government has admitted in the last 20 years combined. In 10,000 zip codes across all 50 states, Americans are proving that they have the giant hearts, the open arms, the generosity and compassion to welcome. And through them, we are finding the national capacity and rebuilding the commitment to welcome many more. The opportunities for all of us to reap the benefits are limitless, and we're just getting started. So I hope you'll join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Naz. Great job. Dropped all my notes just to make things interesting. Okay, we're going to move to a panel session. Actually, they told me that I mustn't introduce the panelists until the chairs were on the stage, so that was a deliberate dropping of my notes. I threatened to dance, and they said, you're too old to dance, to entertain the audience. I think I can start introducing our panel now. We've got 3 great contributors to the discussion. His Excellency Mayor Atiqul Islam, he's the Mayor of Dhaka North City Corporation in Bangladesh. Amy Pope, the Director General-elect of the International Organization for Migration, and Amar Rahman, the Global Head of Climate Resilience for Zurich Resilience Solutions, part of the Zurich Insurance Company. Please give them a very warm welcome. So, Mr. Mayor, we're going to start with you. Dhaka in Bangladesh is probably known as a name by many in the audience, but give us a sense of the population of Dhaka and the kind of strains and stresses arising from the climate crisis that you're facing, and more particularly, how are you coping with those strains and stresses? How are you trying to insulate your city and your population from the emerging climate crisis?
Thank you very much. Thanks the audience, thanks the colleagues. Let me introduce about the Bangladesh. Bangladesh is the country. We got independent in 1971, and it is located in the map. If you see, there is the downstream of China, India, and Himalaya. So when the water, after the heavy rainfall in China and India and Nepal, it has to go through the Bangladesh. So this is technically, the Bangladesh is a very vulnerable country and is 180 million people. And now at this moment, the capital in Bangladesh is called Dhaka. And in 2011, our Honorable Prime Minister, she made it two separate Dhaka. One is Dhaka North City Corporation and another Dhaka South City Corporation. And the total, the population is 30 million for the two cities. And I am representative Dhaka North, which is the 15 million people at this moment. And top of that, every day, 2,000 people are coming in influx for the displacement. That's another big threatening. And yes, I cannot say no. Even I just given an example. My time is not over, right? Is that going on? So I just say last few days, the one guy with 3 small kids, they want to meet with me. But of course, my security and other things, they're not going to talk with them. But I met with that guy, and he said, what's going on? He said, sir, I came this city last 15 days. I want a rickshaw license to run my family. But as you know, that to get a rickshaw license is very difficult, and I'm not going to issue any rickshaw license because Dhaka is already 15 million people. 15 million. And why they are coming? That guy, he has said, sir, I had a very fantastic family. I have agriculture and all these things. Now, due to the saline water, everything is underwater. What I'm going to do? So I come back with my 3 kids in Dhaka city. I need a job. So, but this is not their fault. They are not responsible for anything. But this is the reality at Bangladesh and at this moment reality in the city. Of course, as you know that we have 2 challenges. One is the international challenges, that is the Rohingya issues. 1.4 million refugees now at this moment in Bangladesh. 1.4 million. And we have to ensure their food and other things. And top of that, every day in Dhaka city is coming 2,000. And where they will go, we have to give them the well-being, ensure their dignity, ensure their safety, ensure their health. And that's a big challenge. As a mayor of the city, we have to ensure. Of course, our national government is coming, giving, but it is not enough. The informal settlement, when they are staying there, they are staying in the slum areas, and the daytime they are doing their business in the footpath. Why they have this kind of situation now? Due to the, of course, the climate change, one of the big climate change. And I am one sure that another thing is coming too much to all the society. There's the conflict. There's another threatening for our future generation as well.
And Mr. Mayor, let me jump to a question that I was supposed to ask you later, but I think it's better to follow it up now. What do you want from the international community? Obviously, you want them to mitigate their own climate emissions, but what do you want in terms of international coordination and support?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, at this moment, my city is under serious crisis of the dengue. The climate change is one of the, because the temperature is going very high. And till now, 800 people are died, and in my city is around 560 people are died already. So I urge to all of you, please come give me the support to how we can do the for the eliminate of this kind of awareness, because dengue is the only question of awareness. So I need fund for the international agencies. This is the fund for the, for the hospital, for the urban. I need to set up a urban clinic, urban community clinic. For the urban community clinic, at least the climate displacement, they can go immediately to this kind of urban community clinic, and we can help them, so at least we can save their life. This is the one of the big challenging. And of course, the air pollution. Air pollution is another big threatening. We have to ensure their well-being, their dignity, and of course, low-cost finance as well.
Okay, we'll come back to some of that before anyone gets the wrong idea about Dhaka, it also has the world's largest literary festival, which is an absolutely extraordinary event, which I've had the privilege to attend. Amy, you're the Director General-elect of the IOM, so you're at the heart of the questions that we're addressing in this session. What do you want to achieve in your term that starts next month as the Director General of IOM?
So there are three key issues that I'm really pushing forward on. One is this one. It's the impact of climate on human mobility. We know, I was in Nairobi last week for the Africa Climate Summit. We know there 7.5 million people last year were displaced. But the number that actually worries me far more is that we know that 300 million people live in extremely vulnerable communities when it comes to climate impact. And we know that the key issue for many and many of those communities, the key difference between someone who lives in Florida, for example, or New Mexico or Arizona, is that air conditioning is not an option for them. As Zamali was saying earlier, many of these folks are farmers, they're pastoralists, they rely entirely on the land. And so when you see the impact of climate, when they can't farm, when they can't fish, when they can't make a living, they have no choice but to leave. So my first goal is to build the awareness of, so that we can drive the resources to, and we can start building into our strategic plans as a UN agency, but also national plans to anticipate and adapt to what's happening in terms of climate change. Because if we don't do that, even as countries are busy trying to mitigate climate damage, if we don't start to help communities adapt now, the crisis could be quite significant. The numbers of lives lost could be extremely significant. And of course, the number of people who will be displaced will be numbers that we haven't yet seen.
Do you want to tell us your other two priorities?
Yeah, number two. So one of these, I think, is the answer, is one of the adaptation strategies, which is to start looking at more regular pathways for people. So let's not wait until a farmer is displaced from his or her farm. Let's start thinking in advance. How do we build the skills? How do we create a pathway? Some of it will be in the country itself. Some of it will be regionally. Some of it will be globally. But recognizing that when we think about migration as a tool for adaptation, rather than just as a consequence of failure to plan, we actually can unlock tremendous potential. That leads me to my third priority, which is that we as a UN organization cannot do it alone. We need all of you on the stage. We need the private sector. We need civil society. We need to build out the whole ecosystem to make this real.
Great. Now, you said as a UN organization, there may be some people here who think IOM, UNHCR, OCHA, UNICEF, UNDP, how do they all fit together? Tell us from your perspective the distinctive role of IOM.
So IOM serves people on the move. And we are different from UNHCR because, as Zamali very, very helpfully explained at the outset, in 1951, member states got together, they drafted and adopted a convention which defined a refugee. And that in particular means there are protections for people who fall into those categories, people who are persecuted because of who they are, or their social group, or their gender, or religion, for example. But that no longer fits. I mean, I think we all have come to agree that the vast number of people on the move, the evidence shows, I don't even care if you agree with it, the evidence shows that the vast number of people on the move are moving for other reasons. So our job at IOM is to provide support for the number of people who are on the move who will not qualify for refugee protections.
Right. And what about her point, which I thought was very interesting, that we don't have data beyond the borders?
There is some data, but the big missing piece is connecting the dots. So we have, at IOM, we actually do a tremendous amount of data, understanding why people move, where they move, what is driving them, where they're going. What we haven't done, and this for me is what's one of the most important things to happen, is what you described a little bit in terms of your work, is taking data from other entities, for example, NASA, the World Meteorological Association, and we layer that on top of what we see and know about displacement. So then we start to create a picture of who is being moved, who's being displaced because of climate. More importantly, who will be displaced because of climate. Because that, to me, when we talk about what are the most successful interventions here, it's on the front end. We don't wait until 3 million people have fled their homes in Somalia, right? We don't wait. I was in Dadaab last week. 100,000 people have arrived from Somalia into Kenya over the last 2 years because of drought. We should not be waiting for those 100,000 people to come. We should be working with communities well in advance. You know, you see drought number 2 or 3. By the time you get to your 4th season of drought, no action. What's the problem, right? So that's where we, as a global community, have a real responsibility to act.
Great. I'm going to turn to Amar now, but if anyone does have a question that's really good, or a comment that is really brilliant, put up your hand and I'll bring you in, and then we'll all judge how good your comment was. Just one second, sorry. Let me bring in our third panelist, and then I'll kind of turn to you. Amar, I mentioned at the beginning that risk mapping at a granular level, more local than the nation state, was weak in this area, especially in the fragile context. And of course, risk mapping is your business, because you're at Zurich Insurance and you need to do good risk mapping to judge your rates. Tell us what lessons you think there are from your practices that could help the discussion that we've been having here.
It's a very good point. I'm glad you brought up in the beginning, because I didn't like the scripted question. That was
okay.
You mentioned that the situation in northeast Syria is different than in Bangladesh. And I'll go one further. Situation changes from neighborhood to neighborhood. From house to house, the risk situation can change. And when we tend to think of risk, we conflate risk with hazard level. So the first question we get asked is my location in a high flood zone, in a high wind zone? But that's one component of risk. We start off with the vulnerability. What is the pain point for your operation or for your community? What is it that you're trying to protect? What demographic? Is it the museums? Is it the artifacts? We start with there, because you could have a very low hazard level. You could have only a couple of inches of rain, but if you have a high exposure and if you have no controls around the exposure, the risk is very high. So that the perception of risk is very important, to tell people that even though the hazard level is low, you've never experienced a flood in your lifetime, or it rains, but it rains only a couple of inches, to make people aware that there is a risk even though the probability is low. That's a huge challenge, because our perception of risk is driven by what we experience.
And are you working with city governments like the mayor here to help them map risks? 15 million people is a hell of a lot of people, because people associate Zurich Insurance with their house insurance. How are you thinking about cities and municipalities?
Yeah, we've been doing this for over 10 years. We actually started specializing this as a consultancy service within Zurich Insurance right after the Thai floods in 2011. And the methodology that we developed, we apply with cities as well. In fact, we just worked with the Madrid City Council around this, looking specifically at the impact of heat on school children. So it's the same approach. It's just, let's call it, the value chain is a little bit different. What you're trying to protect is different. In a corporation, it's you're protecting your profit, you're protecting your supply chain, and so on. In the city, we need to identify where the vulnerable demographics is, and so on. One other point, we talk about climate change, but we go one step further and we say it's the change in the environment. And what does that mean? Is that you're having higher population in some areas, the infrastructure is degrading, the level of protection, the quality of protection is not being maintained, and that makes the situation worse with time. So we tend to look at that holistic view around risk.
Was there a question here? Yeah, give the lady a mic.
Well, you asked for a question or comment. My first comment is AI. Wouldn't AI help in terms of matching people with resources and also jobs? And I know this is an issue in our country where they have to deal with the work permit situation to help people resettle and not be a drain. And I frankly don't understand why that isn't happening.
Thank you very much. Let's ask the mayor and then maybe go to Amy and then Amar. Mr. Mayor, how are you using predictive analytics, other technology to help anticipate what's coming? Or do you actually just have people, is the movement of people enough of an indicator?
Yeah, that's the one thing that's challenging, that to give the technological support to the city as well, because I'm just giving in one example that, like, we want to make my city to save from the air pollution. So when from the air pollution, to save all the cities, but there is especially, there's a three-wheelers, there is a two-wheelers, and we want to stop them. But there's a very difficult to stop for the three-wheelers and two-wheelers because they are all running with the lead battery. And that is the one of the biggest challenge. So the technological and technical support is very much indeed to my cities because I cannot evaluate, I cannot vanish all the support, especially for the technical and technological support. Those are running the three-wheelers and two-wheelers. So I've urged also in this room that give me the support to convert into this kind of two-wheelers and three-wheelers into EV rather than to demolish this kind of two-wheelers and three-wheelers.
Thank you. I think your mic is on your lap, under there. Amy, what's your answer on the AI?
So we're still a ways away from doing that. I'm excited to say, and this is why the private sector partnership is so important to us. We spent several days with Microsoft right on the margins of the Africa Climate Summit. They're working with us to help use our data and then draw on other data sets to start to do that kind of predictive analytics. But there are gaps, right? So we need to draw in the different data sets. Then, most importantly, once we have that data, we do need our donor community to get behind funding solutions. So, I worked in crisis management, both in the private sector and the public sector. You will know when the floods come, when you look at Libya or Morocco, when there's a tremendous disaster, the money pours in. There is not the same kind of money for the much lower cost of helping people prevent disaster or stabilizing communities. So the knowledge, the data is step one, right? Then there's a lot that needs to follow.
Great, and quick word from Amma, and then we'll take one more question, and then we'll let you all go.
The approach that we apply is exactly as Amy described it. We bring in the data, we layer it, and we get a better view of the risk. And you can improve the data quality, you improve the density of the data that you have, so you bring in more data, and then you could teach the system to do some basic analytics. But the problem is that you have an interconnectedness of risk. And let me give you an example of Bangladesh. With sea level rise, with subsidence, the land going down, what you're having a situation is that when the coastal areas flood, it takes a longer time for the water to drain. Yeah? And that has an impact on the soil. And that has an impact on the agriculture. It has an impact on the way people have been doing their activities for hundreds of years. So they need to change crop, they need to change the way that they're doing their agriculture. So these kind of scenarios we would need to substantiate with data, and we get that through these systems.
Thanks.
Super quick question. I know we heard earlier from Welcome.us about the amazing welcoming from American citizens, but at the same time, we're starting to see around the world leaders put up barriers in the sea. We're seeing the United Kingdom outsource refugees to Rwanda. We're seeing boats sink off the coast of Greece. I'm curious whether you're worried about what seems to be a sort of a tightening of a nationalism around the world that will cause additional problems with the climate problems that are adding to migration crisis.
Amy, why don't you answer that and then close the... That's a good question for you.
Needless to say, we're worried about the rhetoric, right? And we do see that there are some communities that are closing down. But we also know, especially when you layer on the demographic changes that are happening around the world, that there is an increasing need for migration. So my goal as an organization is that we are facilitating those regular pathways, because while there's a lot of anxiety when people see folks coming up at the border or coming across the ocean or the sea, there's almost no anxiety when someone comes with a visa and a job, shows up, does something that is added benefit to their community, or is welcomed into their community by a church group or family group or something else that allows them to better become part of the fabric. So for me, the initiative that NAS is leading is so important because it connects people into opportunities. Building out more regular pathways is key to responding to the climate crisis because it takes us out of the political conflict into something that is very practical and very beneficial for the migrants, for the communities they've come from, and the communities that they're now living in.
Well, look, the bolt of lightning is going to come in 53 seconds, so I don't dare take another question. I'm very sorry to the two people at the back. We're going to have to wind up. Can you please give a big round of applause to thank our excellent panel? Thank you very much indeed.